I began to write as a child. I've always been writing. The first poem that I know of was a very short little love poem written at 13, an age when most people probably write short little love poems. And I kept going. I took some writing workshops in high school and as a graduate student. I wrote very privately at first. Later on, I published some poems. The atmosphere of the 60s was very expansive and very exciting. I was in Berkeley. And I was often going into, I've written about this in a number of essays that are in my book, Goddesses. I lived on Telegraph Avenue. I was involved in many protests, and I was a teaching assistant at the time, and we were all very engaged with what was going on politically and also spiritually. Many amazing spiritual teachers were beginning to come from Asia to the West Coast. I learned to meditate. And I hung out I would go to Cody's books almost every day, read the latest book of poetry, hot off the press. In those days, instead of poetry being scorned and hidden in the most remote corner and smallest of the bookstore, which is now folded and not even existent, poetry was on the shelves in the front window, and I would walk in standing up and read whatever had just come out by Michael McClure or whoever, Robert Duncan, Denise Levertov, and then of course if I really loved the book I'd buy it, and then I'd step across the street in the Cafe Mediterranean and have a cappuccino and read and hang out with friends there. And so it went. I mingled studying German literature. I had majored in French literature at Stanford prior to that, so I was always very focused on literature. I had actually started out as a pre-med student. I had wanted to be a psychiatrist starting at the same age I fell in love with poetry, around 14. That was always the plan. The two have always been totally entwined. But I was very discouraged by my misogynist advisor, and I wasn't really ready, so I kind of shifted early on at Stanford over from pre-med into French literature, which was quite wonderful. I graduated really fast in 3 years and went on to graduate school for several years at Berkeley in German literature, and I then got a teaching credential in education. But meanwhile, everything was exploding around me. I did finally get around to going to medical school. Just shortly before I turned 30, I went off to New York City, to New York University School of Medicine. And that stimulated a lot of poetry. I had been writing in my 20s in Berkeley and publishing some poems, but the cultural shift from Berkeley in the 60s to New York in the 70s and medical school, of course, was a big shake-up for my psyche. And I was very powerfully struck by the people and the patients I was seeing in Bellevue Hospital. And I was also having a lot of flashbacks on moments in Berkeley. So I was writing a lot of very crisp portraits. I published my first book when I was in my 30s. It's called Of Your Seed. It was published by wonderful Oh Yes Press, who published Denise Levertov and Robert Duncan and many other very fine poets in the 60s. And then in the following decade, or in that decade actually, at that time I was in medical school. The poems in that first book have many poems I wrote during my first year of medical school, and some poems from Berkeley in the 60s. And after that point, I published several other books of poetry, and toward the end of the 90s, I edited an anthology called She Rises Like the Sun, Invocations of the Goddess by Contemporary American Women Poets. This was a wonderful selection of poems by 29 marvelous poets, including Maya Angelou, Diane de Prima, Judy Grahn, Susan Griffin, Joy Harjo, Carolyn Kaiser, Denise Levertov, and Marge Piercy, and so forth. And we're planning a new anthology, which in a sense will be an update of She Rises Like the Sun, Invocations of the Goddess by Contemporary American Women Poets. The new book will not be restricted to goddess imagery. It's called 100 Visionary Women Poets. And it will contain magnificent and very deep poetry written from the beginning of time, beginning with the first poet that is known, Enheduanna, a priestess in Mesopotamia in 2500 BC. Her poetry exists, written in clay tablets. And then continuing around the world throughout time up to the present moment with very contemporary women poets. And I'm co-editing that with Mara Keller, the director of the Women's Spirituality Program in San Francisco at California Institute for Integral Studies. But that's something in process. It's only beginning. It's a big project. In the year 2000, I published a collection called Changing Woman. And since that time, have also published a collection of stories, a spiritual journey book, Journeys with Justine. I have many books. There are about 20 books, but a number have come out in this last decade, include one, Walk Now in Beauty, The Legend of Changing Woman, is illustrated by Ernest Posey, is now out in 3 languages, a trilingual edition, so that you have on each page 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Japanese. It's a beautiful book. Ernest, who's no longer alive, did the illustrations. He called them sand paintings, but his way of making sand paintings was to move sand on a copier with a feather. Early in this decade, my selected works came out in the Palace of Creation. And then I did a second major translation of the poetry of Francis Cham in the last 6 years, Under the Azure. I'd like to read a few of his poems. Francis Cham lived in the Pyrenees, and he was a wonderful poet of childhood. When he was older, he wrote a series of poems reflecting, evoking childhood. Here's a very short one, A Sunday Like a Cake. There was a Sunday that was like a cake. I was taken to the house of Father Fiteau, a notary who lived in the country. The meal was like a holiday, heavy, sad, and beautiful, and my companion was a little girl called Your Niece. Afterwards, she and I went walking in the orchard where melancholy pear trees were rising up in flames. The birds were whispering on the branches. Oh, my heart, that magnificent day was surely a love among the angels. Here's another about his childhood. Do you remember, love, the day the meadows turned stony and the valleys were wet with light? And the mountains had the color of those balsamic liqueurs the monks make. It was evening, and I could feel my heart expanding out toward the snow on the tall golden green peaks, and tears came to my eyes imagining the land of my childhood. There, toward the cold, pure air, toward the dense snows, toward the mountain people, toward the shepherds, the sheep, the goats and the watchdogs and the wooden flutes shining from calloused hands, toward the raucous bells of grazing flocks, toward the sluice waters, the sad gardens, the gentle presbyteries, toward the kids who followed singing, the conscripts who were singing, toward the summer waters, the white fish with red fins, toward the fountain in the square in the village where I was a sad and good little boy. dining room. There is a faintly glowing cupboard that has heard the voice of my great aunts, heard the voice of my grandfather, heard my father's voice, and to their memory is faithful. Do not assume she is always silent, for we talk. There is also a wooden cuckoo. I do not know why he has no voice. I do not want to ask. Perhaps quite simply it broke, the voice that was in the spring, like the voice of the dead. There is an ancient buffet, too, scented with beeswax, preserves, meat, bread, and ripe pears. He's a loyal servant who understands he must never steal anything. Many men and women who do not believe in these little souls have visited me, and whenever a visitor enters and says, "How are you, Monsieur Jam?" thinking I am alone, I smile. So that's Francis Cham. And a few years earlier, I had anthologized a selection of teachings by the great saint and humanitarian Mata Amritanandamayi, who's known throughout the world as Amma, the hugging saint. She was born in South India in the 50s, and for decades has been traveling the world, embracing over 30 million people and guiding a very large network of charities, including schools, hospitals, colleges, food, housing programs, hygiene, and green projects. Amma's teachings are very straightforward and very profound. I, in 2004, collected some of her messages in a book called Messages from Amma in the Language of the Heart. I'll read 2. The divine is present in everyone, in all beings, in everything. Like space, it is everywhere, all-pervading, all-powerful, all-knowing. The divine is the principle of life, the inner light of consciousness and pure bliss. It is our very own self. And from the speech that she gave at the United Nations in Geneva on the condition of women, anyone, man or woman, who has the courage to overcome the limits of the mind can attain the state of universal motherhood. The love of awakened motherhood is a loving compassion not only for one's own children, but for all people, animals, plants, rocks, and rivers. It is a love extended to all nature's beings. For one who has awakened to true motherhood, every creature is his or her child. Such love, such motherhood, is divine love, which is God. A couple of new collections of her teachings will be coming out in the next couple of years. One is called Garland of Love, and the other, Love is My Religion, the Essential Teachings of Mata Amritanandamayi. And I would enjoy also reading 2 newer poems from a forthcoming collection, which I think is called Majesty. The Forest. When you are in a forest, think of all the levels. Down deep where you cannot see is a whole world. Roots coil and curve in every direction. Worms, mud, bugs, and seeds among rock, and below, the molten zone. But here on the ground is the richest realm of all, soil mulched by the deaths of the countless, and new life springing ever upward into brilliant flowering bulb and bush, bromeliad and tree. Birds nest and millions of years of animals roam, woman and child, and a man resonating like music with the leaves and damp air, sunlight streaming downward through sapphire blue light, clouds drifting in perpetual journey. And above them, hundreds of thousands of galaxies, star diamonds, birthing and dying. Yes, think of all the levels, because we humans are like the forest, with our root people, worm people, mud and seed people, orchid people, little you and towering sequoias, cosmos of slithering cold bloods, restless animal and soaring bird people, and beyond airy spheres of cloud people, blazing sun people, soft moon people, and the innumerable star people who sparkle most brilliantly in blackest night, and all evolving deeper and wider and higher into the unknowable mystery. Mystery. You are the living goddess, and I bow to you. All the crickets chant Om, and the moon glows. Time lies down in the corpse pose, and the night births hundreds of thousands of galaxies. You are the mystery, without question or answer, and we are the inevitable explosion of awe. And I've been very focused on my spiritual path in the last 20 years and have experienced many wonderful spiritual teachers from many traditions, including the Dalai Lama and Pir Vilayat, the Sufi master. I've also been engaged as a translator ever since my 20s. While I was in Berlin in the mid-60s, I discovered the work of Elise Schuler. She was a renowned German poet who was driven out of Germany by the Nazis, literally chased down the street with a pipe by a group of Nazi rednecks, basically. And she was so intuitive that she went straight to the train station. She never went back to her apartment. She never got any of her things. She got on the train, she went straight to Zurich. It was 1932. She arrived in Zurich. She spent the night on a bench in the park, and then friends took her in. She was there for a short while and went down to Palestine. She hated Palestine. You can imagine how different that was from Berlin. She had led a very sophisticated life in the avant-garde. She was a bohemian. And Palestine was very rough and really nitty-gritty and poor and dry and hot. So it was hard for her. And she was older. She was in her 60s. But then the state of Israel came about, and the people of Israel and Palestine, they loved her. She was very eccentric. One story I remember is that she used to clean her room, her little room, by kind of walking around with a cloth, just pushing it around with her foot. She was older. It was probably arthritis. She was probably too stiff to lean over. But she just lived a very ascetic life. And I read her poetry, steeped myself in, and I translated it over a period of 30 years. And finally, Star in My Forehead, Selected Poems of Elise Schuler, came out. Not until 2002 it was published by Holy Cow Press in the Midwest. This is the way books go. They always take so much more time than anybody can ever begin to imagine. And basically I work day and night all the time, 7 days a week. I love it. I see patients I have a very small practice nowadays. I used to see a lot more patients over in Berkeley, but now I have a small practice, and then I write on my books, and I'm working on a handful now. The new one, and I think my best book, is Ardor, Poems of Life. It's being published by Pilgrim's Press in India. It will be available online and through my website, JanineCanan.com, from which I'll read just 2 poems. Conquering Muse. My muse, says the old poet, cannot be seen, but speaks in a voice I never mistake. Every word she utters is enthralling. At times she does not bother with words, and if I don't catch her drift, turns cool. At times I sense her silent in the mist. Sometimes she whispers just a word or two, but now, like a river-jumping bank, she floods and crashes, washing away everything. And I am her slave, washed in her irresistible, roiling passion, this absolute energy that seizes me like a limp, brittle puppet. Oh, I know she commands me, speak, in flames that crackle, roar, and bleed, laugh and sing out what we have to hear and long to hear, what alone makes us weep unashamed with naked shattering joy, her answer of undeniable, mysterious love. Her name. She is dancing her dance and everything changes. This is what is meant by impermanence, Buddhist for God. She is dancing her dance and nothing remains. This is what is meant by nothingness, atheist for God. She is dancing her dance and everything is beautiful. This is what is meant by changing woman, Navajo for God. She is dancing her dance and planets whirl around the sun. This is what is meant by Allah, Sufi for God. She is dancing her dance and her forms are never ending. This is what is meant by Shakti, energy, Hindu for God. She is dancing her dance and the dance is she. This is what is meant by God, human for mystery. Basically, I'm a poet, and it's all poetry to me. The essays are the most, basically, I write very short poems, and then I write longer poems, and at a certain point I began to write these more expansive, longer narrative poems. And then that expanded further into short stories. They're basically giant prose poems, my short stories. They're extremely poetic. Each one is a self-contained entity, like a poem. You can just read it without going through the series when you're reading the Journeys with Justine book. It's 19 epiphanies of Justine. It's kind of her spiritual journey from when she's about 13 until she's middle-aged. But it's all poetry. And then while I was in my 50s, you really are sensing your mortality, and it's very common for people to suddenly want to record the experiences they've had. And that bug bit me in my 50s. It's past now. And it's a good thing that's when I wrote a lot of essays. And those are even more expanded. Once you get into the that's as far into prose as I've ever gone. And they have a kind of rhythmic arc that is still quite poetic. The essays that I have written, and I continue to write essays when I'm asked to for this anthology or that situation. I've written a long essay about my experiences with the unbelievably marvelous British novelist Iris Murdoch. I wrote an essay about Ali Akbar Khan, the Indian great Indian sarod player and teacher of Indian music who lived in the Bay Area. Reviews of mine of Diane de Prima, Alma Villanueva are here, and introductions to some of my books, about introductions to Elsa Laska Schuler, to the goddess poets, and She Rises Like the Sun. A long essay about James Broughton called Love's Guru, the wonderful gay poet and a dear friend of mine. Maria Gimbutas, the great archaeomythologist who did the work on the goddess civilization of Europe in the Neolithic. She did the major digs. She taught at UCLA. She was born in Lithuania. So those are some of, I've written an essay about my relationship to California. I'm a fourth generation native Californian, and I departed for 6 years and lived in Washington on the Olympic Peninsula, and at that time I wrote about California. And now my mind wants very much to distill the essence of what I think is important for people. The teachings, I feel a lot of important moral teachings, a lot of our culture and civilization on every continent in the world is being lost faster than you can blink an eye, and many of us are very concerned about this. So I want to say what I think is most important about living life in my work.